Hi, this is Son of Gord. This is part 3 of a short story that I wrote during lockdown in 2020-2021. If you haven't already, I'd suggest you go back and watch the first 2 parts before watching this one. There'll be one more part of this story which will be out next Saturday. Just want to say thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this story, and I will be adding more content like this in the near future. Thanks again for watching. See you next week for part 4. Gordon slumped into the control seat. It's no use, these people are just simple nomads. Have you managed to locate any potential fuel sources? There are plenty of fuel sources, but all unrefined, and we don't have the equipment to refine the fuel we need. Gord sensed an air of I told you so in Olmy's voice. Well, it looks like calling Mother is the only option, Gord said glumly, and then added, let's explore a bit more first, though. Gordon was keen to at least take something positive from this disastrous excursion. Gord fired up the jets, and slowly the hopper rose out of the sand. Let's just follow that coastline and see if we can discover something, anything worthwhile. They travelled along the coastline for about an hour. Inevitably, the control panel began flashing. Their fuel was now critically low. Gord shifted their course inland slightly and looked for a suitable place to set the hopper down. The terrain was quite hilly. Gord landed at the base of a rocky hill in front of a small cave. It was getting late, so Gord decided they ought to make camp. He called to Olmy to give him a hand, and the two of them carried his brother's ark of convenience into the cave, which contained his secret ration store. They set it down on the sand. Gord snapped a couple of illumination bars he had stuffed into his back pocket as they lifted off the heavy lid. Inside were 3 bottles of holly wine, some water and plenty of snacks, which he thought should last him at least a couple of weeks. Gord had already resigned himself to the fact that he was in a serious shit this time. He was most likely going to get the crap beaten out of him, so stealing his brother's rations was not going to make the situation any worse than it already was. Besides, he needed to eat. He built a fire, managed to make up a bed in the sand using some blankets he'd found in the ark. The sun descended rapidly. The fire cast a pleasant glow, causing the shadow flames to dance around the inside of the cave. Gord poured some of his brother's wine into a metal beaker and for the time being pushed his predicament to the back of his mind. Before long he was snoring softly as the fire flickered in the darkness. He awoke briefly a few hours later. It was dark and really cold, but the blankets were pretty well insulated, and he was warm and quite comfortable as he dozed in and out of consciousness for a couple of hours. By the time he was ready to get up, the front of the cave was bathed in brilliant sunlight. He sat up, dug around in the ark, found a protein bar and a bottle of water, and sat for a while wondering how he should spend the day. Once he had finished his breakfast, he stepped outside the cave. The sunlight hurt his eyes. He entered the hopper. Olmy turned towards him and burst out laughing. What now? Gordon said indignantly. Have you seen your face and your hair? Gord leant over the blank navigation screen to look at his reflection, immediately recoiling in stunned surprise. In less than 24 hours, the lower half of his face had gone from having a fairly minimal amount of erratic stubble to being completely covered by a thick bushy beard, and his hair, which had been fairly short, was now hanging down by his shoulders. What the heck? Gord spluttered, completely flabbergasted at his transformation. It suits you, Olmy smirked. Relax, it's just a slight reaction to the elevated radiation levels. I'm going out to have a look around, Gord decided. Olmy looked at him exasperatedly and said, Shouldn't we be thinking about contacting your mother and getting home? Yeah, maybe, Gord replied with a hint of agitation in his voice. Gordon, you're just delaying the inevitable. I know, I'll see you later, he replied, stepping out of the hopper. The doors closed swiftly behind him. He recorded his position, initiated his cloaking device, and once again set off into the unknown. He trudged around the hillside where they had made camp, wandering for a good hour until he stumbled upon a settlement. From a safe distance, he watched the inhabitants with interest. They were a simple species. Their dwellings were basic, quite beautiful in fact, and appeared to have sprung up from the landscape in which they were situated. After observing them for a while, he had an overwhelming desire to be amongst these people, to hear them speak and breathe the same air they did. He made his way down the hillside on which he had positioned himself. He was careful not to get in their way. He was invisible to them, of course, and did not want a repeat of the experience he had had during his previous encounter. The people he observed were similar to the two men he had seen leading the reluctant humped creature. They were short, had beautiful, light, dusky complexions, dark eyes, dark curly hair, and were dressed in simple, loose-fitting robes, apparently designed to shield them from the sun. Strange aromas permeated the air, some pleasant and some quite offensive to his nostrils. The older inhabitants were stooped and had small, wizened faces marked with deep lines. By contrast, the younger inhabitants had beautiful open faces, and some of the women were incredibly pretty, and Gord felt a stirring in his loins as he watched them go by. They spoke in a confusing primitive dialect that his auto-translate had some difficulty deciphering. He caught snatches of conversations, but nothing he could attach any meaning to. He stood for some time in the shade, leaning against a whitewashed wall, watching the people going about their business. Gord's own people were considerably more advanced than the primitive inhabitants of this planet. It hadn't always been that way, though, and he wondered if this species possessed the intellectual capacity to reach a comparable level of sophistication to that of his own people. As he stood pondering these questions, his ruminations were arrested by a vision of beauty the like of which he had never seen before. She was typical of her species, but her features were incredibly fine, and even with the obstruction of the loose-fitting robes that covered her body, he discerned a slender, intoxicating figure. Gord was hooked. Instinctively he followed her, but at a safe distance to ensure he was not discovered. After walking for a while, she turned down an alleyway and stopped at a small dwelling, typical of the other dwellings he had already seen. He crept closer to her and silently slipped inside the dwelling behind her.